The fluorescent lights hummed softly above Elias's head as his fingers moved across the keyboard, methodical and practiced, like a pianist who had played the same song 1,000 times. The CEO's laptop sat open before him, its screen glowing pale blue in the dimness of the corner office, and for a moment the world felt small and predictable. Just another Tuesday, just another repair, just another invisible task in a life built on invisible tasks. He had learned long ago to move through spaces like this without leaving a trace, to fix what was broken and disappear before anyone remembered his name. It was safer that way, quieter, less complicated. But then his eyes caught something they weren't supposed to see. A folder buried deep within the system, marked only with a date from years ago, and inside it, a single photograph that glowed like a secret kept too long in the dark. The woman in the photo was smiling. Not the polished, camera-ready smile he had seen in corporate newsletters and conference banners, but something raw and unguarded, the kind of smile that belongs to a moment when no one is watching and the world feels kind. She stood beneath a canopy of trees, sunlight filtering through the leaves like golden confetti, her hair loose and wild, her feet bare in the grass, and there was a lightness to her that seemed impossible now. A version of herself that felt like a different lifetime, a different person entirely. Elias stared at the image longer than he should have, his hand frozen on the mouse, and something inside him stirred, not desire, not attraction, but recognition. He knew that feeling. He had lived it. The ache of looking at a photograph and not recognizing the person staring back, the quiet grief of realizing that somewhere along the way, you had become someone you never intended to be. And then, without warning, the air in the room shifted. He heard the door click shut behind him, soft as a breath, and when he turned, she was there. Dr. Helena Varin, the CEO, standing just inside the threshold with her arms folded loosely across her chest, her gaze fixed not on him, but on the screen. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The silence stretched long and thin, fragile as a thread pulled too tight, and Elias felt his heart kick hard against his ribs, guilt flooding through him even though he had done nothing wrong. But then she stepped closer, her heels whispering against the polished floor, and when she finally spoke, her voice was quieter than he had ever heard it, soft and trembling, like someone asking a question they had been afraid to ask for years. "Do you think I'm pretty?" she said, and the words hung in the air between them, heavy and strange and impossibly vulnerable. And Elias realized in that moment that this was not a question about appearance at all. It was a question about time, about loss, about the person she used to be and the person she had become. And suddenly the world felt much less predictable than it had 5 minutes ago. Elias had not always been invisible. There was a time, years ago, when he had walked through the world with a different kind of presence, lighter, freer, less burdened by the weight of everything he carried now. Back then, mornings had tasted like coffee shared across a small kitchen table, like laughter that spilled into the hallway and little hands reaching for his face with sticky fingers still warm from sleep. But that version of his life had ended the way some stories do, not with a dramatic collapse but with a quiet unraveling thread by thread, until one day he looked up and realized he was standing alone in a house that felt too big and too empty all at once. His wife had left when their son was 3, walked out the door with a suitcase and a look in her eyes that said she had already been gone for months. She didn't leave a note. She didn't leave an explanation. She just left, and Elias had learned to stop asking why, because some questions don't have answers that make the pain any smaller. Now his life moved in rhythms he had not chosen, but had learned to follow. Wake up before the sun, pack a lunch with the crusts cut off because that's how his son liked it, drop him at school with a kiss on the forehead and a promise to be home by dinner. Then came the work, office buildings and server rooms, broken hard drives and forgotten passwords, hours spent fixing problems for people who never looked him in the eye. He was good at his job, efficient and reliable, the kind of person companies called when something went wrong and forgot the moment it was fixed. And in the evenings, he would return to his son, help with homework, read bedtime stories in voices that made the boy giggle, and then collapse into bed with the kind of exhaustion that lived in his bones. It was a life built on survival, not joy, A life where every day felt like driving a car with no fuel gauge, never quite sure if he had enough left to make it to the next stop. But he kept going, because that's what fathers do. They keep going, even when the road ahead is dark and uncertain and impossibly long. And yet, somewhere beneath the exhaustion, beneath the routines and the responsibilities and the quiet ache of loneliness, Elias still remembered who he used to be. He remembered the man who had dreamed of building something meaningful, who had believed in possibilities and second chances, and the idea that life could surprise you in beautiful ways. That man felt distant now, like a stranger glimpsed through a window. But he was still there, buried perhaps, but not gone. And sometimes late at night when his son was asleep and the house was still, Elias would sit in the dim glow of the television and wonder if anyone saw him anymore, really saw him, not as a technician or a father or a man struggling to hold everything together, but as a person with a heart that still beat and dreams that still whispered. He wondered if he had become invisible, not because the world had stopped looking, but because he had stopped believing he was worth seeing. And that thought, more than anything, was the one that kept him awake long after the rest of the world had fallen asleep. Dr. Helena Varin had built an empire from silence. Not the kind of silence that comes from peace, but the kind that comes from discipline, from learning early that vulnerability was a currency she could not afford to spend, that softness was a language the boardroom did not speak. She had climbed every rung with precision, her heels clicking against marble floors like a metronome keeping time with ambition, her voice steady and commanding in rooms where men twice her age had tried to make her small. And she had won. She had taken the corner office with the floor-to-ceiling windows, the title that made people straighten their spines when she walked past, the respect that came not from warmth, but from fear. But respect, she had learned, was a cold companion. It did not call her by her first name. It did not ask how she was feeling. It did not sit with her in the quiet hours when the building emptied and the city lights flickered on like distant stars, and she was left alone with the echo of her own footsteps. At the top of a skyscraper, the silence is so loud it feels like screaming. Helena had discovered this truth slowly, the way one discovers a wound that has been bleeding quietly for years without notice. In meetings, she was Dr. Varin, sharp, unshakable, the woman who could dissect a failing strategy with surgical precision and rebuild it before the coffee had gone cold. But in the elevator, in the moments between floors when she was alone with her reflection in the polished steel, she was just Helena, a woman who had forgotten what it felt like to be seen as anything other than a title, a woman who had traded intimacy for influence and was only now beginning to realize the cost. People looked at her, yes, but they did not see her. They saw power, they saw success. They saw a woman who had everything, and so they assumed she needed nothing. And the loneliest part was that she had worked so hard to make them believe it. She had not always been this way. There was a version of Helena that existed before the boardrooms and the late-night strategy sessions, before the armor she had learned to wear like a second skin. That Helena had laughed easily, had danced in the rain without worrying about her hair, had believed that connection mattered more than control. But life had taught her otherwise, had shown her that softness was a liability, that trust was a risk she could not afford. And so she had buried that version of herself, locked her away in a photograph hidden deep within a laptop folder, a relic of a time when she had been free and unguarded and impossibly naive. Sometimes late at night, Helena would open that folder and stare at the image, at the woman with bare feet and wild hair, standing beneath the trees with a smile that seemed to hold the whole world, and she would wonder if that person still existed somewhere inside her, or if she had been erased entirely by the woman she had become. And the question that haunted her most was not whether she could go back, but whether anyone would even recognize her if she did. Elias had seen many things in his years as a technician, files marked confidential, emails never meant for outside eyes, digital footprints of lives lived in private corners of hard drives. He had learned to look without seeing, to move through information like a ghost passing through walls, leaving no trace and taking nothing with him. But this photograph was different. It did not feel like an accident or an invasion. It felt like a message, like something that had been waiting for him to find it, as if the universe had conspired to put him in this room at this moment, with this image glowing softly on the screen. The woman in the photo radiated a kind of freedom that seemed almost impossible now. Her face turned toward the sun, her arms open as if embracing the sky, her whole being alive with a lightness that made his chest ache, and the contrast was so stark it felt like looking at two different people. The Helena he knew from brief hallway encounters was composed, controlled, untouchable, but this Helena, the one frozen in pixels and memory, was raw and unguarded, and beautifully, impossibly human. Photographs are strange things. They are not just images, but anchors, tethering us to moments we can no longer reach, reminding us of who we were before the world reshaped us into who we had to become. Elias understood this intimately. He had his own photograph, tucked away in a drawer at home, of a family that no longer existed, his wife's hand resting on his shoulder, his son barely a year old, all three of them smiling, as if they had no idea how fragile happiness could be. He rarely looked at it anymore. It hurt too much, but he understood why someone would keep such a thing hidden, why they would bury it deep where no one could find it, where even they might forget it was there. Because sometimes the hardest part of moving forward is carrying the weight of who you used to be, knowing that person is gone and will never come back, no matter how much you miss them. And now, staring at Helena's photograph, Elias felt something shift inside him. Not pity, but recognition. He saw in her image the same thing he had felt staring at his own, the quiet grief of transformation, the ache of becoming someone new, not because you wanted to, but because survival demanded it. She had built her empire, yes, but what had she sacrificed to lay the foundation? What parts of herself had she left behind in that field of trees and sunlight? He thought about the version of himself he had abandoned when his wife walked out the door, the man who had believed in partnership and permanence, and the idea that love could be enough. That man was gone now, replaced by someone harder, more careful, less willing to hope. And yet, looking at this photograph, Elias wondered if maybe those lost versions of ourselves never truly disappear. Maybe they just wait, patient and quiet, for someone to remember them. Maybe they live in hidden folders and forgotten drawers, calling to us across the years, asking to be seen again. And maybe, just maybe, the bravest thing we can do is answer. For a moment, Elias could not speak. The question hung in the air between them like something fragile and precious, something that might shatter if he moved too quickly or breathed too hard. Helena stood there, her arms still folded across her chest, but there was nothing defensive about her posture now, only a quiet vulnerability that made her seem smaller somehow, less like the woman who commanded boardrooms and more like someone who had forgotten how to be seen as anything other than strong. Her eyes were fixed on the photograph, on the version of herself that smiled back from the screen, and Elias could see the tension in her jaw, the way her fingers pressed into her own arms, as if holding herself together. This was not a casual question. This was not small talk. This was a woman standing at the edge of something she had been avoiding for years, finally finding the courage to ask what she had been afraid to know. "Do you think I'm pretty?" she had asked, and now, as the silence stretched between them, she added softly, almost as if afraid of the answer, "Pretty like in this photo. Or pretty like I am now." And there it was. The real question beneath the question. The wound she had been carrying all this time. It was not about beauty, it was never about beauty. It was about identity, about whether the person she had become was still recognizable, still worthy, still deserving of being seen as human, and not just as a title or a role or a machine built for productivity. Elias had heard questions like this before, though never spoken aloud. He had heard them in his own heart on the nights when he looked in the mirror and wondered if anyone would ever see past the tired single father to the man who still dreamed, who still hoped, who still wanted to be more than just functional. He knew what it felt like to ask if you were still worth noticing. He knew what it felt like to be afraid of the answer. He chose his words carefully, not because he was afraid of offending her, but because he understood that this moment mattered in ways he could not yet fully comprehend. "I think," he said slowly, his voice gentle and steady, "that the woman in this photo is beautiful. But I also think the woman standing in front of me right now is beautiful in a different way. Not less, just different. Helena's eyes flickered toward him, searching his face for insincerity, for politeness disguised as truth, but she found none. "The woman in the photo looks free," Elias continued, his gaze returning to the screen. "And the woman I see now looks strong. But I think maybe you're wondering if you can be both. If you're allowed to be both." The words landed softly, like stones dropped into still water, and for the first time since she had entered the room, Helena's shoulders softened. She did not smile. She did not thank him. But she nodded just once, a small acknowledgement that he had heard what she was really asking, and that sometimes being heard is enough. Helena sat down then, slowly, as if the weight she had been carrying for years had finally become too much to hold upright. She lowered herself into the leather chair across from Elias, the one reserved for executives and clients, and for a moment she looked almost out of place in it. Not because she did not belong, but because she had shed something in that small exchange, some invisible armor that had made her seem larger than life. Now she was just a woman sitting in a room with a stranger, and the space between them felt less like a divide and more like a bridge waiting to be crossed. Elias closed the laptop gently, as if tucking the photograph back into its hiding place with care. And when he looked at her again, he saw not the CEO who signed his paychecks, but a person who was tired of pretending. And something in him softened too, because he knew that exhaustion intimately. He had been pretending for years, pretending he was fine, pretending he had it all together, pretending that being a father was enough to fill the empty spaces where a partner used to be. "I don't recognize myself in that photo anymore," Helena said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper, as if speaking the words aloud made them too real. "I look at her and I think, who was she? What was she doing with her life that made her smile like that? And why does it feel like I failed her somehow?" Her hands rested in her lap, fingers laced together, and Elias could see the tremble in them, the way she gripped herself as if afraid she might fall apart if she let go. He understood that feeling too. He thought about the man he used to be, the one who believed love was a promise that could not be broken, who had built his entire world around a woman who decided one day that she no longer wanted to live in it. That man had disappeared the moment she walked out the door, replaced by someone more practical, more guarded, more focused on survival than on dreams. And Elias had spent years convincing himself that this was growth, that this was what it meant to mature and adapt. But sitting here now, listening to Helena speak the truth he had been avoiding, he realized that maybe it was not growth at all. Maybe it was just grief, dressed up in responsibility and routine. "I don't recognize myself either," Elias admitted, the words slipping out before he could stop them. Helena's eyes lifted to meet his, surprised, and he felt a strange sense of relief at finally saying it aloud to someone who might understand. "I used to think I knew who I was. I had a wife, a family, a plan. And then one day it was all gone, and I became this. A guy who fixes computers and makes breakfast and tries not to think too much about what comes next." He paused, his throat tightening with emotion he had not expected to feel. "I look at old pictures of myself sometimes and I don't see me. I see someone I used to know, someone I'm not sure I'll ever be again." The silence that followed was not uncomfortable. It was the kind of silence that holds space for truth, the kind that does not demand anything but simply allows two people to exist in their shared understanding of loss. And in that moment, something shifted between them. Not love, not attraction, but something quieter and perhaps more profound. Connection. The kind that happens when two people realize they are not as alone as they thought, that someone else in the world knows what it feels like to lose yourself along the way. Helena leaned back in her chair, her gaze drifting toward the window where the city stretched out below them, a sea of glass and steel glittering in the afternoon light. She was quiet for a long moment, as if deciding whether to cross a line she had never allowed herself to approach before, and when she finally spoke again, her voice carried the weight of years kept silent. "That photo was taken on the last day I felt like myself," she said, and the words came slowly, carefully, like she was handling something fragile. I was 26. I had just quit my first corporate job because I hated who I was becoming. I hated the suits, the meetings, the way everyone spoke in buzzwords and forgot to say what they actually meant. So I left. I took all the money I had saved and I went to this little town by the coast, rented a cabin, and I stayed there for 3 months. No plan, no ambition, just me and the ocean and the trees. Elias listened without interrupting, sensing that this was not a story she told often, maybe not a story she had ever told at all. Helena's fingers traced the edge of the armrest absently, her eyes still fixed on the horizon, and he could see the way memory softened her features, made her look younger somehow, as if the act of remembering brought her closer to the woman in the photograph. I thought I was going to figure out who I wanted to be during those 3 months, she continued, a faint, bitter smile tugging at the corner of her lips. I thought I'd have some great epiphany, that I'd come back with clarity and purpose and all the answers I'd been looking for. But instead, I just existed. I walked on the beach. I read books. I talked to strangers in coffee shops who didn't know my name or care about my resume. And for the first time in my life, I felt light. I felt free. I felt like I mattered, not because of what I accomplished, but just because I was alive. But freedom, Helena explained, was not something the world rewarded. When the money ran out and reality came knocking, she returned to the city with nothing to show for her time away, except a photograph and a memory of what it felt like to breathe without the weight of expectations crushing her chest. She took another job, then another, climbing higher each time because that was what people did. They climbed, they succeeded, they proved their worth through titles and paychecks and corner offices with views that stretched for miles. And with each promotion, each achievement, each moment of recognition, she felt the woman in the photograph slip further away, until one day she realized she could not remember the last time she had felt light, the last time she had smiled without a reason, the last time she had existed simply for the sake of existing. I told myself it was worth it, Helena said softly, her voice cracking just slightly at the edges. I told myself that sacrifices were necessary, that you can't have everything, that some versions of yourself have to die so new ones can survive. But lately I've been wondering if I killed the wrong version, if I buried the best part of me and built an empire on top of her grave. And when she finally turned to look at Elias again, her eyes were glassy with unshed tears, and he saw in them the truth she had been carrying alone for far too long, that success, no matter how grand, could never fill the space left by a self you had abandoned. Something had shifted in the room, something neither of them could name but both could feel, a kind of electric stillness, like the air before a storm breaks and the world holds its breath. Elias found himself leaning forward slightly, his elbows resting on his knees, his hands clasped together as if in prayer or contemplation, and for the first time in longer than he could remember, he felt seen. Not as the technician who fixed problems quietly and left without fanfare, not as the single father who existed only in relation to his son's needs, but as a person with a story worth hearing, with pain worth acknowledging, with a heart that still beat beneath all the layers of responsibility he had wrapped around himself. Helena had opened a door, and without meaning to, Elias found himself walking through it, stepping into a space where vulnerability was not weakness, but currency, where honesty was not a risk, but a relief. I used to think that being a good father meant disappearing, Elias said, his voice quiet but steady, the words tumbling out like water finally finding a crack in a dam. I thought it meant putting everything I wanted on hold, every dream, every hope, every version of myself that wasn't directly useful to my son. And maybe that was true at first. Maybe that's what he needed when he was little and scared and didn't understand why his mother left. But somewhere along the way, I stopped just putting myself on hold. I erased myself. I became this function. Wake up, make breakfast, go to work, come home, repeat. And I told myself it was noble, that it was what love looked like, that sacrifice was the purest form of devotion. He paused, his jaw tightening as emotion rose in his throat. But the truth is, I was hiding. I was using my son as an excuse not to face the fact that I was terrified of being seen again, of letting anyone close enough to hurt me the way she did. Helena watched him carefully, her expression softening with each word, and Elias could see recognition flickering in her eyes. Not pity, but understanding, the kind that only comes from walking a similar path through the dark. "When my wife left," he continued, his voice rougher now, edged with the kind of pain that never fully heals, "she didn't just leave me. She left a question I couldn't answer. She made me wonder if I had ever been enough, if I would ever be enough, if there was something fundamentally broken in me that made people walk away. And instead of facing that question, I buried it. I buried myself. I became invisible on purpose because invisible people can't be rejected. They can't be abandoned. They can't be hurt." He looked up at Helena then, his eyes meeting hers with a raw honesty that made him feel exposed and liberated all at once. "But you can't be loved either. Not really. Not when no one can see you." The silence that followed was profound, the kind that does not demand to be filled, but instead holds space for truth to settle into the bones. Helena's hand moved almost unconsciously toward him, hovering for a moment in the air between them before she let it fall gently onto his forearm, a touch so light it felt like a question more than a statement. "I see you," she said simply, and those 3 words carried more weight than any boardroom speech or executive decree ever could. They were not a promise or a solution or a fix for the years of loneliness they had both endured. They were just the truth, spoken plainly, without artifice or agenda. And for Elias, who had spent so long believing he had become invisible by necessity, those words felt like a lifeline thrown across dark water. Someone saw him. Someone looked past the uniform and the function and the carefully constructed walls, and they saw the man still standing behind them, bruised and tired and imperfectly human, but still there, still breathing, still hoping, despite everything, that maybe it was not too late to be seen. The days that followed were strange and unexpected, like watching a film where the plot had veered off its predicted course and into something unfamiliar and quietly thrilling. Helena began calling Elias back to her office more frequently, sometimes for legitimate technical issues, a frozen screen or a corrupted file, but more often for reasons that felt invented, excuses that barely disguised what was really happening. She wanted to talk. She wanted to sit in that space they had carved out together, where titles and roles dissolved into something more human, where 2 people who had spent years performing strength could finally admit to being tired. And Elias, who had grown so accustomed to moving through the world unnoticed, found himself looking forward to those calls, found himself checking his phone with a kind of anticipation he had not felt in years, wondering if today would be the day her name appeared on his screen again. Their conversations unfolded in layers, each one peeling back another piece of the armor they had both worn for so long. Helena told him about the boardroom battles she had fought and won, but also about the ones that had cost her friendships, relationships, pieces of herself she could never get back. She spoke about the loneliness of leadership, the way people treated her like a monument instead of a person, how she had become so good at being untouchable that she had forgotten how to let anyone in. And Elias listened, really listened, not with the polite attention of an employee, but with the deep presence of someone who understood, because he had his own version of the same story. He told her about the mornings when his son asked about his mother, and he had to find new ways to explain an absence that made no sense, about the nights when the house was too quiet, and he wondered if he would spend the rest of his life alone, about the fear that he had become so defined by survival that he had forgotten how to live. And slowly, imperceptibly, something began to shift between them. Helena started smiling more, not the practiced, professional smile she wore in meetings, but something warmer, something that reached her eyes and made her look like the woman in the photograph, just for a moment. Elias noticed the change in himself too, the way he stood a little straighter when he walked through the office, the way his voice carried more confidence, as if being seen by someone had reminded him that he existed beyond his function. People around them began to notice as well. Colleagues whispered in break rooms about how Dr. Varin seemed different lately, softer somehow, more present, and Elias's co-workers remarked that he seemed lighter, that the perpetual exhaustion that had lived in his shoulders for years seemed to be lifting, even if just a little. Neither Helena nor Elias acknowledged these changes out loud, but they both felt them, the way you feel sunlight on your skin after a long winter, tentative at first, then warming, then undeniable. They were becoming visible to themselves again, and it was happening because someone else had chosen to see them first. It arrived on a Tuesday morning, buried in Helena's inbox between quarterly reports and meeting requests. An email so mundane in its presentation that she almost deleted it without reading. But something made her pause, made her click it open, and when she did, the words on the screen felt like a door opening to a room she had locked years ago and sworn never to enter again. It was an invitation from the coastal town where she had spent those 3 transformative months, a small arts festival celebrating local culture and community, and they were reaching out to former residents, asking if anyone wanted to return and share their story, their connection to the place that had shaped them. The email was warm and casual, written by someone who clearly had no idea they were extending an invitation that felt less like an opportunity and more like a confrontation with everything Helena had been avoiding. She read the email 3 times, her hands trembling slightly as her finger hovered over the delete button, and each time she tried to convince herself it meant nothing, that it was just a random message from a place she used to know, that she could ignore it and move on with her day as if it had never arrived. But she could not. The words kept pulling at something deep inside her, something she had buried beneath years of achievement and ambition and carefully constructed control. The town wanted her to return. The place where she had been free, where she had smiled without reason, where she had existed as just Helena and not Dr. Varin, CEO, leader, untouchable force. That place was calling her back, and the timing felt impossibly cruel and impossibly perfect all at once. She closed her laptop and sat in silence, staring at the city beyond her window. And for the first time in years, she allowed herself to ask the question she had been avoiding. What if she went back? What if she returned to that version of herself, even if just for a weekend, and saw what was still there? But fear is a powerful thing, and Helena had lived with it so long, it had become a companion she trusted more than hope. What if she went back and discovered that the woman in the photograph was gone forever, that the freedom she remembered was just nostalgia dressed up as truth, that the place no longer felt like home because she was no longer the person who had lived there? Worse, what if she went back and realized she had made a terrible mistake, that the life she had built, the empire, the success, the respect, was hollow, that she had traded everything meaningful for something that looked impressive but felt empty? The questions circled her mind like vultures, and she knew she could not answer them alone. So that afternoon, when Elias arrived to check on a software update she did not actually need, Helena told him about the email. She told him about the invitation and the fear and the impossible choice it represented. And when she finished speaking, her voice barely a whisper, she asked him the question that had been haunting her since the moment she opened that message. "Do you think I should go?" Elias did not answer right away. He let the question sit between them, turning it over in his mind like a stone smoothed by years of water, feeling its weight and texture before offering it back to her. He could see the conflict written across her face, the hope battling the fear, the longing wrestling with the terror of disappointment. And he recognized it because he had worn that same expression 1,000 times in the mirror. It was the look of someone standing at a crossroads, knowing that either direction would change them, and neither promised safety. Finally, after what felt like an eternity compressed into seconds, Elias spoke, his voice gentle but firm, carrying the kind of truth that only comes from someone who has nothing to gain from lying. "I think you're asking the wrong question," he said, and Helena's eyes widened slightly, surprised. "You're asking if you should go, but what you're really asking is if you're brave enough to find out who you still are underneath everything you've built." He leaned forward, his gaze steady and unwavering, and there was something in his expression that made Helena feel both exposed and understood all at once. "I spent years avoiding places that reminded me of my wife," Elias continued, his voice softer now, tinged with the kind of regret that comes from wisdom earned too late. "The restaurant where we had our first date, the park where I proposed, even certain songs on the radio. I'd change the station the second I recognized the opening notes. I told myself I was protecting myself, that I was being smart, that there was no point in reopening old wounds. But the truth is, I wasn't protecting myself. I was hiding. I was so afraid of feeling the pain again that I ended up feeling nothing at all. And you can't live like that. You can't build a life on avoidance. Eventually, you have to turn around and face what you left behind, not because it will fix everything, but because you deserve to know what's still there. Helena listened, her hands gripping the armrests of her chair as if anchoring herself against the tide of emotion rising in her chest. She wanted to argue, to list all the logical reasons why going back was impractical, why the past should stay buried, why some doors were meant to remain closed. But she could not find the words because deep down, she knew Elias was right. She had been running for years, not from a person or a place, but from a version of herself that terrified her with its vulnerability, its openness, its belief that life could be simple and beautiful without ambition to justify it. "What if I go back and she's not there anymore?" Helena asked, her voice breaking slightly, and Elias knew she was not talking about the town. "What if I've changed so much that I can't find my way back to who I was?" Elias smiled then, a sad, knowing smile that held more understanding than any words could convey. "Then at least you'll know," he said quietly. "And maybe that's enough. Maybe just knowing is the first step to becoming someone new, someone who carries both versions, the free one and the strong one, and doesn't have to choose between them anymore." The decision did not come all at once. It arrived in pieces, like puzzle fragments scattered across days, each conversation with Elias adding another small clarity until the picture began to take shape. Helena found herself thinking about the invitation at odd hours, during meetings where executives debated profit margins and market strategies, during sleepless nights when the city lights cast shadows across her bedroom ceiling, during quiet mornings when her coffee grew cold in her hands as she stared at nothing and everything all at once. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, the fear that had gripped her so tightly began to loosen its hold, not because it disappeared, but because something stronger was growing beneath it. Curiosity. She wanted to know. She wanted to see if the town still smelled like salt and pine, if the cabin she had rented still stood on the hillside, if the version of herself she had left behind had left any traces that could still be found. One evening, after another invented excuse had brought Elias back to her office, Helena made her decision out loud. "I'm going to go," she said, the words tumbling out quickly, as if she might lose her nerve if she hesitated. "I'm going to accept the invitation. I don't know what I'll find there, and honestly, I'm terrified. But I think I need to know. I need to see if any of that freedom is still waiting for me, or if I've locked it away so completely that it's gone forever." Elias looked at her with something that resembled pride, the kind of expression one person wears when they watch another finally choose courage over comfort. And he nodded slowly, his smile warm and genuine. "I think that's the bravest thing you could do," he said. "Not because going back is easy, but because facing who you used to be takes more strength than building empires ever could." But then Helena did something that surprised them both. She reached across the space between them, her hand finding his, her fingers curling around his palm with a tentative urgency that spoke louder than words. "Come with me," she said, and the request hung in the air like a dare, like a question neither of them had expected, but both suddenly realized was inevitable. Elias stared at her, his heart pounding in his chest, because this was not just an invitation to a coastal town or an arts festival. This was an invitation into her life, into her vulnerability, into the sacred space where she kept the parts of herself she had never shown anyone. And more than that, it was an acknowledgement of what had been building between them all along. Not romance in the traditional sense, not the kind of love that arrives with fireworks and grand gestures, but something quieter and perhaps more profound. The recognition that they were better together than they were alone, that their brokenness somehow fit in ways that made them both feel a little more whole. "I can't do this by myself," Helena admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "I need someone who understands, someone who sees me, and that's you." And in that moment, Elias realized that he had a choice to make too. He could retreat back into his safe, invisible life, or he could step forward into something uncertain and terrifying and possibly transformative. He could keep hiding, or he could finally let himself be seen. The drive to the coast felt like traveling through time itself, each mile peeling back another layer of the lives they had constructed in the city, stripping away the titles and responsibilities, until all that remained were two people sitting side by side in a car, watching the landscape transform from steel and glass to open sky and endless green. Elias had arranged for his son to stay with a trusted friend for the weekend, and though guilt had tugged at him as he packed his bag, he reminded himself of what Helena had said in her office, of what he had told her about becoming invisible. You cannot be loved when no one can see you. And perhaps, he thought, his son deserved a father who was whole, who had faced his own ghosts and come back stronger, not just functional, but alive. Helena sat in the passenger seat, her fingers drumming nervously against her knee, her eyes fixed on the horizon as if searching for something she could not yet name. She had not been back in over a decade. The town might have changed. She had certainly changed. But as the road wound through forests that seemed to glow gold in the afternoon light, she felt something stirring inside her. Not quite hope, not quite fear, but something in between, something that felt like awakening. When they finally arrived, the town greeted them with a quietness that felt sacred, as if the world had softened its edges just for them. The ocean stretched out beyond the main street, vast and unchanging, its waves rolling in with the same patient rhythm they had always known, and the air tasted of salt and memory. Helena stood on the sidewalk outside the small cafe where she used to spend her mornings, and for a moment she could not move, could not breathe, because everything looked exactly the same and completely different all at once. The cafe was still there, its blue-painted shutters weathered but charming, its windows glowing warm against the approaching dusk. The bookstore next door still displayed its hand-painted sign. The cobblestone path still wound down toward the beach. But she was different. She was older, harder, carrying weights the younger version of herself could never have imagined. And standing there, caught between who she had been and who she had become, Helena felt tears prick at the corners of her eyes, not from sadness, but from the overwhelming collision of past and present. The grief and gratitude of returning to a place that had once held the best version of herself. Elias stood beside her, close enough that their shoulders almost touched, and he did not speak because he understood that some moments do not need words. He simply stood there, a steady presence, a reminder that she was not alone in this, that whatever she found or did not find, whatever answers or absences waited in this town, she would not have to face them by herself. And after a long moment, Helena turned to him, her eyes bright with unshed emotion, and she smiled, a real smile, trembling but genuine, the kind that comes from someone who has finally stopped running. "Thank you," she whispered. And though the words were simple, they carried the weight of everything she could not yet articulate. "Thank you for seeing me. Thank you for believing I was worth finding. Thank you for reminding me that it is never too late to come home to yourself." Elias reached for her hand, his fingers lacing through hers with a gentleness that felt like a promise, and together they walked toward the cafe, toward the beach, toward the ghosts and memories and possibilities that waited in this place where Helena had once been free. The journey was not over. In many ways it was just beginning, but for the first time in years, neither of them felt afraid of what came next. The festival had transformed the town into something luminous and alive. Strings of lights crisscrossing the narrow streets like constellations brought down to earth. Music drifting from open doorways, laughter spilling into the evening air with a warmth that felt almost tangible. Helena and Elias wandered through the crowds, their hands still loosely intertwined, and everywhere Helena looked she saw echoes of the life she had lived here. The corner where she used to buy fresh bread in the mornings, the bench where she had sat for hours reading novels that made her cry, the path that led down to the water, where she had watched the sun rise more times than she could count. It was disorienting and comforting all at once, like stepping into a dream where everything is familiar but slightly altered, and she found herself gripping Elias's hand a little tighter, anchoring herself to the present, even as the past swirled around her like a tide she could not resist. They found the cabin just as dusk was settling into night, perched on a hillside overlooking the ocean, its weathered wood silvered by time and salt air. Helena had not planned to come here. It had not been on any itinerary, had not been part of the careful boundaries she had set for this trip. but her feet had carried her here anyway, as if her body remembered the way, even when her mind tried to forget. She stood at the gate, staring at the small structure that had once been her refuge, and something inside her cracked open, a dam breaking after years of holding back a flood. This was where she had been happiest. This was where she had woken each morning to birdsong and possibility, where she had cooked simple meals and read poetry on the porch, where she had fallen asleep to the sound of waves and dreamed of a life that felt like enough. And she had left it. She had walked away from this peace, this simplicity, this version of herself who believed that joy did not need to be earned or justified or built on the backs of 90-hour work weeks and sacrificed relationships. "I was so happy here," Helena said, her voice breaking as tears finally spilled over, running down her cheeks in streams she did not bother to wipe away. "I was so unbearably, impossibly happy, and I convinced myself it wasn't real, that it was just a phase, that I had to go back and become someone important, someone who mattered. But what if I was wrong? What if this was the realest I've ever been, and everything I built after was just a beautiful lie?" Elias turned to face her fully, his hands coming up to cradle her face with a tenderness that made her breath catch. And when he spoke, his voice was steady and sure, carrying a truth she desperately needed to hear. "You weren't wrong," he said gently. "You were scared. You were young, and the world told you that happiness without achievement was selfish, that peace without productivity was laziness, that being enough as you are was impossible. And you believed it, because that's what we're taught. But Helena, you're here now, you came back, and that means the woman in that photograph, the one who knew how to be free, she's not gone. She's been waiting. And maybe, just maybe, you can learn to carry both versions of yourself forward. The strong one and the soft one. The CEO and the woman who dances in the rain. You don't have to choose anymore." And standing there in the fading light, with the ocean whispering its ancient song, and Elias's hands warm against her skin, Helena finally allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, he was right. The weekend passed like a fever dream, vivid and surreal, each moment etched into memory with a clarity that felt almost painful. Helena spoke at the festival, standing on a small wooden stage beneath the stars, and she told her story, not the polished, professional version she had rehearsed in her mind, but the raw, honest truth of a woman who had lost herself in the pursuit of success and was only now learning to find her way back. She spoke about the photograph, about the cabin, about the years she had spent building an empire on the grave of the person she used to be. And when she finished, the crowd did not applaud with the thunderous appreciation she was used to in boardrooms. Instead, they offered something quieter and more profound: recognition. Faces in the audience nodded with understanding. Eyes glistened with shared pain. And afterward, strangers approached her not to network or seek favors, but simply to say thank you, to tell her that her story had touched something in them, that they too had lost themselves along the way and were searching for the courage to come home. Elias watched from the side of the stage, his heart swelling with something he had not felt in years. Pride, yes, but also hope, the kind that whispers that maybe broken things can be repaired, that maybe lost things can be found, that maybe two people who had learned to survive alone could learn to live together. When Helena finally left the stage and found him in the crowd, she did not say anything. She simply walked into his arms, letting herself be held for the first time in longer than she could remember, and in that embrace she felt something shift inside her, some final piece of armor falling away. She was tired of being untouchable. She was tired of being strong without softness, successful without joy, respected without being known. And here, in this town that remembered who she used to be, held by a man who saw who she was now, Helena finally allowed herself to be human again. The drive back to the city was quieter than the journey out, but it was not a heavy silence. It was the kind of quiet that comes after a storm, when the world feels washed clean and everything is still settling into place. Helena and Elias did not make grand declarations or promises they were not ready to keep. They did not solve all their problems or magically become different people. But something had changed nonetheless. Helena returned to her corner office, but she began leaving at reasonable hours. began asking her employees how they were doing and actually listening to the answers, began remembering that the people around her were not just functions, but souls carrying their own invisible weights. And Elias continued fixing computers and raising his son, but he no longer felt invisible. He carried himself differently, spoke with more confidence, allowed himself to believe that maybe he was worthy of being seen, that maybe his story was not over, but simply entering a new chapter. They saw each other often after that weekend, not as CEO and technician, but as two people who had found in each other a mirror that reflected not their accomplishments or their failures, but their essential humanity. Sometimes they met for coffee before work, sitting in a quiet cafe and talking about their days, their dreams, their fears. Sometimes Elias brought his son to the office on weekends, and Helena would sit on the floor with the boy, helping him build elaborate structures from blocks, while Elias watched with a smile that reached his eyes. And sometimes, late at night when the city was asleep and the stars were bright, Helena would pull up that photograph on her laptop, the one of the woman standing barefoot beneath the trees, and instead of feeling grief, she would feel gratitude. Because that woman was not gone. She had simply been waiting, patient and quiet, for Helena to remember that she existed. And now, finally, she did. If this story touched something inside you, if it made you think about the versions of yourself you've left behind or the person you're still trying to become, please leave a like and subscribe. It helps this channel continue bringing you stories that speak to the heart, that remind us we're not alone in our struggles, that whisper the truth we all need to hear. It's never too late to come home to yourself. Every story here is a reminder that love, for others, for ourselves, for the lives we've lived and the lives we're still building, is always worth finding. Thank you for being here. Thank you for listening. And thank you for believing that stories like this still matter.